Okay, so welcome to this presentation called Let Technology Generate Your Leading Indicators. Now normally this is in person, it's an interactive presentation, but obviously we can't do that right now. So what I'm going to do for you is go through the normal presentation, and then at the very end or during the presentation, I think you'll be able to ask questions and I'll do my best to answer them. So before we get started though, just a little background on me. I work for the safety software company Safety 101, and I've been in the safety industry for almost 5 years now, and I've learned a lot of interesting things. I've met a lot of interesting people, and I've worked with a lot of different businesses, from manufacturing to construction to nursing home to services companies to, I mean, you name it, across the board, people that make Eggos. So it's just, I have a lot of different experiences with a lot of different industries. And so what I'm going to try to do with this presentation is really try to, I think, make this something that is relevant to a lot of you and what you do on a daily basis. So let's get started here. All right, so I mean, when you think about it, with a safety management system, and this is just a basic principle, that any successful safety management system is going to be a balance between leading indicators and lagging indicators. And you know, that's not just me saying that, that's the Campbell Institute of the National Safety Council, but it's something that makes sense. I mean, what a lot of us think of when we think of a safety program metric are things like incident rate or DART score, because that's what a lot of OSHA and other state OSHA plans measure a business on. And so what we're going to be doing in this presentation is focusing on the leading indicator part of it. So going to the next slide here. So just to, if you're not 100% familiar with leading indicators, probably most of you are, but how the Campbell Institute defines them is they say that leading indicators are proactive, preventative, and predictive measures. Well, lagging indicators measure EHS performance. So that's why the two really go hand in hand. If you're going to have a really successful safety program, which everyone here wants, then that's why, you know, you need a blend of both of these things. So going to the next slide here. So normally you would have a handout in front of you entitled Leading Indicator Cliff Notes, and we would sort of go through it, and some of you may ask questions, but what I really want to do is just kind of, you should have that document provided for you, but one item of particular interest, at least at the federal level, is it appears that OSHA has a new focus on leading indicators. So when you look around at the various literature and websites on the topic, there's stuff out there, but from OSHA, especially federal OSHA, there's not really a whole lot of mention of it. But in June 2019, OSHA published its first ever guide on leading indicators, June 2019. So then in November 2019, OSHA held its first ever public hearing on the use of leading indicators. So, and then of course 2020 happened, and you know, nobody remembers anything about what happened last year. But what this says though is, by OSHA doing this, and look, I interact with a lot of different safety people, both at private, public organizations, and also with people that work on the enforcement side of OSHA and the continuing education side of OSHA. And if you ask a lot of people that work in OSHA, especially at continuing education, they will say that that's going to be a continued focus going forward, of focusing on leading indicators, just because it's something that really makes sense. Now there is one article that I found really good on leading indicators, published in November 2019 by EHS Today, entitled OSHA Embraces Leading Indicators, which kind of goes into what I just mentioned a little bit ago. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So if you look across the spectrum, at least in the United States, you know, there are companies that are looking at leading indicators in their safety program, and you've probably heard of at least one of these. If you look at like Honeywell, for example, what Honeywell focuses on for leading indicators is digital safety observation system available to all employees, which what they say is that maximizes the eyes and ears of the organization, which makes sense because a lot of, especially if you kind of break down safety incidents into 4 categories: observed hazards in increasing severity, observed hazards, near misses, minor injuries, and then ultimately OSHA recordables. I mean, everybody's familiar with the triangle where, you know, at the bottom you have observations, and then for every however many you're going to have a near miss, and then for however many minor, and then recordable. I mean, most of you are familiar with that. So what Honeywell is doing though is they're basically saying to people that work on the front lines of the business, we want to give you a tool for you to report things that you're seeing, because if we can catch something that is an observation before it becomes a near miss or even an injury, well, that's a good example of a leading indicator. So the next company is Cummins. Now, what's interesting with Cummins is their leading indicator focuses on training hours. And what they found was they found an incredibly strong correlation between the number of training hours and the number of injuries, an inverse correlation. So, and they also found that it made their incident rate decline. So the next company, Schneider Electric. So what they say is that a leading indicator to consider is measurement of training effectiveness via quizzes 2, 3, and 4 months after training has been completed. Now, what's interesting about this is what I've noticed from a lot of people that I deal with is typically when someone gives a course, whether it's in person or online, the quiz will inevitably happen right after the course to test competency, which makes sense. You know, if you want to get a forklift license, you got to pass the quiz, so we make sure that you're able to operate a forklift safely. What I find so interesting about what Schneider does is they basically take the approach of, okay, we test competency right when you take the course, but going down the road in the future, we're going to test you again, which I think is a great idea, because a lot of safety programs are focused on the preventative side of things in training, inspections, getting observations to the appropriate people to deal with them before they become safety incidents. And so if you do something like that, I think that's a great idea from Schneider. Now, what's also an interesting thing they do is they say, in addition to celebrating the number of days and months since a recordable incident, which is pretty common, you know, sometimes you walk into a facility and it says X days since our last injury. They also celebrate the number of observations, total number of training hours, and safety innovations. Now, what's interesting about that one is that second part there of what they track with the observations, training hours, and safety innovations. That's something, especially when you talk to OSHA folks, they really like it when you focus on that one. And you know, it makes sense. Focusing on those leading indicators and giving visibility to that in your organization, and even rewarding people through a safety incentive program, will do wonders for safety. Okay, so the next company, Johnson Controls. So what they said was getting C-suite focus on leading and lagging indicators is a key to success. We all know it comes from the top down. And I think from my own experience and from talking to so many folks in so many different professions, from so many different backgrounds, one of the things that especially frontline employees look for is that management has buy-in to the process, because employees can tell when people are not engaged. And so if you can do things to empower employees, like if an employee reports a safety hazard and then it's corrected like a day or two later, you know, those sorts of things, they make a safety program really catch on, and they give the message to employees, yeah, you know, management really cares about what we're doing here. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Now this would be another handout you would have in front of you. You should be able to access it with the presentation materials, but the resource guide in front of you contains 100 leading indicators that are being used by organizations, both US and internationally. And you know, we'll go through in a second sort of kind of 6 main leading indicators based on OSHA's 6 recommended elements of a safety program. But here's the reality with leading indicators is that depending on the work that you do and depending on how your organization is set up, some leading indicators may make sense, some leading indicators may not make sense. There's so many that you can focus on. I think the key though, especially when I talk to customers of mine about this, is that you know, obviously you have to identify what works for your organization and what you can get buy-in on. But once you do identify with that, you focus on those things that are most important. All right, so let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so this would be question time when I would ask you how many of you are using leading indicators in your safety program. And it's not like how many of you are using them, it's more how many of you have embraced them. Because it sort of feels like from conversations that I have with people, either it's embraced or it's not embraced. There's no middle ground. And a lot of times if there is middle ground, that's when failure tends to happen. All right, so obviously no one's gonna raise their hand because it's just me here, but let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you know, really another question is how many of you use safety software to generate leading indicators? I mean, look, I've seen all different kinds of safety setups, from paper-based systems to Excel spreadsheets to Access databases, Google Sheets, Google Docs, software systems, homemade, you know, just everything. I've seen pretty much everything imaginable. But the one thing that I've noticed, and especially when I ask people the question, because I'm interacting on a monthly basis with hundreds of different safety professionals, and I always like to ask them some basic questions. You know, and one of them is, if they're not using technology in their safety program today, do you generate leading indicators? And the resounding answer is no. It's very, very difficult, because if you think about it, what you're trying to do is take data that's collected at different places and sort of aggregate it together. And it's very, very difficult to do this. And I mean, that's the whole purpose of this course, is not just to talk to you about leading indicators and kind of show you what OSHA has to say about it, but also just show you that it's so much easier to generate leading indicators with technology if you choose to do so. And so to do this, I'm going to use a product called Safety 101. You know, obviously it's what I'm most familiar with, but going to the next slide, there's a lot of safety software options out there. I mean, you have, like, for example, you have GenSuite, and they say that they're a leading cloud-based EHS software solutions provider. There's also Velocity EHS. They define their software as easy-to-use software to simplify your environment, health, safety, and sustainability activities. Then there's Safety 101, software for your safety program. And then there's Intellex. They say they're the world's leading environmental health, safety, and quality management software solution. I mean, really, I'm using Safety 101. It's the system I know best. But like I said, you know, besides these 4 right here, there are so many options out there. And I think the big thing is you just have to find a software system that works for you, make sure it fits within your budget, and make sure it's something that when you do decide that you want to bring a software system into your organization, you can roll it out however you want. Most people like to go a little slower, maybe start with 1 feature or so, get sort of that core group of people at their organization so they can become advocates. And so it's something where when it gets rolled out to the broader organization, that you don't get as much resistance, because that's one of the problems is whenever you change, even if it's changed for the better, it just sometimes is, some people don't like change at all. So before we get into showing you the system here, I just wanted to go through some safety program core elements related to leading indicators. So these 6 things here are OSHA's 6 recommended elements of a safety program. So it's worker participation. So basically it's the number of, a leading indicator would be number of observed hazards and safety ideas, near misses, whatever, submitted. The second would be management leadership. So that would be the average time between the report of a hazard and its resolution. So how quickly are people responding to these employee submissions? The third would be hazard identification and assessment. So this would be the number of safety incidents with not just a root cause investigation, a complete root cause investigations. Asking questions like the 5 why, the fishbone, how did it happen, why did it happen, what needs to be corrected, and then ultimately what are the root causes. And then the fourth item, hazard prevention and control. What is the average amount of time it takes to correct a safety hazard? Because it's one thing to have a safety hazard occur, to have somebody spot it. It's a whole other thing to actually have it corrected. And then the fifth would be safety program evaluation. So that would be the total number of audits or inspections that are completed. And then the sixth would be education and training, which would basically just be the number of training hours. Imagine for a second trying to calculate the number of training hours when you're keeping track of training on a spreadsheet. When I've asked that question to people when they have training spreadsheets, and I'll ask them, so are you keeping track of the leading indicator of the number of training hours recorded? If I'm with them, they'll just kind of look at me with a blank stare. If we're doing a webcast, they'll start laughing at me. All right. So let's get into it here. The first one, worker participation. Okay. So I think the question is, do any of you have a formal process for getting safety input from your team? So there's so many different ways you can do this. Like you can do a physical card, you can have people call a number, talk to a supervisor, send an email, make a phone call, send a text. But the problem with a lot of the ways that this input is coming in today from the people that I talk to is that it's all over the place. It's here, it's here, it's here, it's here. And it gets overwhelming. So that's why it's nice to have a consistent approach to getting that employee input or feedback. Now, what I'm going to show you is what getting employee feedback would look like or input would look like with something like an employee portal, which, like I said, there's so many different ways you can do it. It's just my advice based on conversations with people and, you know, from seeing this in action at various companies is whatever method you use, make sure it's consistent so that way people don't get overwhelmed and employees know what to do. All right, so if you had something like an employee portal, an employee could come in, they could go to report hazard or share idea. They can select their input type if that's something that you have on there. Let's say it was a good catch. They can put their input in, select their work location, put in their detailed location, also put their name in. Now this form right here is based on the VPP hazard reporting system for employees. So if you're not familiar with that, it's part of the VPP regulation because Safety 101 works with both VPP and non-VPP organizations. But what OSHA is very clear about in that regulation, and just OSHA in general, if you talk to any OSHA person, I mean, I get emails for like OSHA fines and OSHA regulations every day going into my inbox, and I can't tell you how many I've seen. OSHA cites employer for employee retaliation. Like, and the interesting thing about it is with all the safety people I've talked to, they say that even if they foster a culture of, you know, we really want your input, some employees feel afraid to say something because they feel like they may get in trouble. And so that's why on this form right here, you'll see employee name is optional, just to be sensitive to that. And then if your portal has something like an attachment, you can attach like a picture, video, something like that, just to give a visual on that. Now let's look at a leading indicator report based on what that would look like. What we have right here is, you'll notice it's called worker participation, but it's the number of observed hazards and safety ideas submitted. So kind of the common theme with leading indicators is what you're doing is you're contrasting the number of injuries typically per month to the number of occurrences of something. So like in this case, it's the number of portal submissions, number of observed hazards and safety ideas submitted. All right, so let's go look at the next one. Okay, so next we have management leadership. So I think the big question here is, does reducing the time required to resolve safety hazards send a message to the broader organization that management is serious about safety? And does that reduce injuries? I think a lot of people would say yes. I mean, I don't even think you need practical experience in the matter. It's just common sense says that, because you know, employee buy-in is such a precious thing to a safety program, and any organization that you talk to that has a really active employee participation or safety incentive program or like that will tell you it's about employee buy-in. So let's look at what a leading indicator would look like for that. Okay, so you can see here this report is called management leadership, and it's the average time between an employee safety submittal and management acknowledgement. Once again, it's contrasting the response time versus the number of injuries there. Okay, now the next one, hazard identification and assessment. So this leading indicator is related to investigating observed hazards, near misses, minor injuries, recordables, that sort of thing. So with this example, you know, we'll look at a report here in a second, but really the question here is, does performing a root cause investigation for every incident, does that uncover patterns that give your safety team a more critical eye for safety issues at your organization? I think a lot of people would say that when they start really digging into things and understanding why do these things keep happening, they would say that, yeah, I mean, it allows us to be more proactive for the future. Even though an incident or an injury has occurred, because we're looking at patterns, we're able to more accurately sort of predict where things might happen. And especially if you're using safety software, you can get metrics and reports that are really going to help you with that. Otherwise, it's just so difficult, because you may say, hey, Fred, do you think we're having a lot of injuries in the build department? I don't know. Yes, no, maybe. Whereas if you have safety software, you don't have to ask Fred that question. You can just go to your system, pull a report, and say, yep, that's where the problem is. We're having lots of back injuries in the build department. One time I was sitting with a user of our system, and it was funny because they said to me, you know, we're having a lot of injuries on the second shift, and I don't really understand why. I'm like, all right, well, let's look at your account. So we went and looked at their account, and we went to the reports, and it's like, huh. So it looks like it's within the second shift, it was the packaging department, and it was a lot of back injuries. And then the person was like, oh, that makes sense. We've been behind lately, and so they've been rushing, and they haven't been following proper lifting procedures, most likely. I know about 5 people that don't have the right belt to go around their waist. And so it's just that's the power of safety software, is it allows you to uncover trends and view reports like a hazard identification and assessment leading indicator report, which is right here. So this is contrasting the percent of incidents investigated with the number of injuries per month. Let's go to the next one. Hazard prevention and control. So I think when it comes to preventing safety hazards, a good leading indicator is the average amount of time required to correct a safety hazard. You know, you hear so many stories about somebody gets hurt and then it's like, oh yeah, we need to fix that. But then it just kind of falls through the cracks because there's kind of no formal communication system. Or, I mean, at the company I was at before, we were a smaller organization, and so everyone was especially strained for those sort of things because at any second, you know, you could have a really big customer come up and say, hey, my machines aren't working, you need to fix this. It's like, oh, we got to drop everything and do it, and then things just get lost. So I mean, when I ask this question to people, most people kind of nod their head a little sheepishly, but you know, a question you should ask yourself is, have you ever had an issue or a hazard or something you knew was a problem go uncorrected for weeks at a time? And most people would say yes. And a lot of the times it's just because, you know, sometimes it falls through the cracks, people forget. And so I think it's a good leading indicator, especially because it brings accountability to the organization, and it really allows you to say, okay, how quickly are we resolving these incidents? Do we need to get better? Did we lag in performance last month? Do we need to shoot for a higher performance next month? That sort of thing. So let's take a look at what that report will look like. So the hazard prevention and control report. It's the average time required to resolve a hazard, number of days right here versus the number of injuries per month. Let's go to the next one, safety program evaluation. One of the most common things that I notice with a lot of safety programs, even those where you may not necessarily have written plans readily available, and if OSHA comes in to an inspection, you know, you can still feel the warm paper out off the printer. But what a very common thing with a lot of safety programs is inspections and training. And so this leading indicator focuses on number of safety audits completed. So, because I think one of the problems is that sometimes when a corrective action is put in place, or if there's a safety issue uncovered, it may get corrected, but then people kind of forget, or some people don't follow the process, and it gets a little informal, and then the same issue can happen again. And so I think the thing about this leading indicator that's so helpful is doing a safety walkthrough is one of the most basic and I think helpful things for a safety program, just because you know, you need that input from the frontline employees for your safety program to really be successful in uncovering issues before they become more serious. But also just going through and looking at things is incredibly helpful. And so let's look at what a report would look like. You can see you could have a leading indicator of number of safety inspections performed, inspections versus injuries per month. Additionally, if you're auditing corrective actions that are taken at your organization, you could have the number of corrective action audits performed versus number of injuries. You can compare and contrast those two. All right, so let's go to the next one. Education and training. I think this may be one of the most important leading indicators. You know, the first 5, you can do all of those, especially the safety inspections. And it's important, all of those things should be done. But without having a properly trained workforce, it's hard to, you know, have a safe work environment. And so that's why what's interesting is if you think back to what we went through earlier with Cummins, they found that the correlation between the number of training hours and number of injuries, the R value of 0.86, which I'm not very good at statistics, but when I looked that one up, it said, hey, that means there's a high degree of correlation. And I think most people would say, just from a practical standpoint and from what makes sense, that, yeah, I mean, if you're more trained on a particular task, chances are you're more likely to perform it more effectively and safely. I mean, it's just not much beats a team that's properly trained. And most organizations that I have interacted with either use paper or spreadsheets or like an Access database. And, you know, obviously, using software is a lot easier, because those systems can definitely work, and I've seen people make great spreadsheets that work. But two of the problems with that are, the first one is a lot of times you're not getting notified of people that need training. And so when that's the case, someone could go without training and be expired for, I don't know, weeks or months at a time. And then what happens if you get a surprise audit that comes in and they look at your training records and they see that people are expired on their training? And just the second thing is the actual documentation of training, because it's one thing to have a training take place, but then you have the licenses or the certifications or the tests, the quizzes, the attendance sheet, who attended, and that all has to go somewhere. So it's just, safety software in general. Look, leading indicators, absolutely safety software. I think it's very difficult, especially from the people that I've talked to generate leading indicators without it. But keeping track of training is one of the hardest things to do. And I've seen some real interesting Excel spreadsheets. So let's go look at what this one looks like. So this will be the total number of training hours versus the number of injuries. I guess just some things to think about. I hope from this presentation, if you were kind of familiar with leading indicators, but it was kind of one of those things you heard about but never really looked into. It's something that maybe you go do a little more digging into, and maybe take some of the examples that I've given you both in the presentation and the handout, and maybe have a conversation with some people and say, hey, is this something that you think we could track, especially if we had safety software? And I think another thing to think about is, can you effectively and efficiently track leading indicators without safety software? And like I said, there's lots of great safety software out there. When you go from not using a software system to using a software system, initially there's a bit of learning involved, because you're changing a way that you capture things. You're not really changing a process, you're more changing how you gather information, so to speak. But it's just one of those things that can so effectively help a safety program and make things more effective, make things stick, and just make it a lot easier. And so just, some topics to think about. And I think that, if you have any questions, feel free to ask your questions. You can also reach out to me directly. My information will be, I believe, in the information about the presentation. And I guess what I would say is, as you go about the coming days, months, years ahead in your safety programs, and a lot of focus is on lagging indicators, obviously, because it's very important. It measures EHS performance. Just also include the leading indicators in there. So thank you for sticking with me and for going through the presentation with me. Normally this would be the part where, like I said, we get into questions, but since it's just me, that's not going to happen. So, but anyways, thank you, and have a great rest of your day.